much for the invitation to this workshop. It's a great pleasure to present here. Well, let's see how it will go. Feel free to ask questions throughout the presentation. So my talk today is about the effects of changes in business taxation on firms, workers and local labor markets. This is joint work with Mimosa Distefano and Dustmann. So there has been a general trend towards lower tax rates on firms' profits. Think, for example, the 2018 reform in the United States, where corporate tax rates were cut substantially. So the main goal of these tax cuts typically is to spur firm entry and also to create new jobs. So the goal is that employment actually increases. We know empirically surprisingly little whether this is actually the case or not. So the goal of our paper is to fill this gap and to paint a more detailed picture of how local business tax changes in the rates at which firms' profits are taxed, so how these affect local labor markets, establishments, and also workers. So what is our context here? We do this for Germany. You will probably not be surprised about that. But Germany is a very interesting country to study this, because in Germany, firms' profits are taxed at a very local level, at the level of the municipality. So that's the smallest administrative regional unit in Germany. And municipalities review the tax rates on an annual basis. So this context lends itself to a difference in difference design, and it has the advantage that we can study many tax changes. So in our context here, we have more than 7,000 tax changes we can analyze that happened between the period 1999 and 2014. So this is the same setting that was exploited by Fuest, Spatial and Sieglock in a paper that recently came out in the American Economic Review. You may be aware of this paper. So this paper exclusively focuses on the wage response to business tax changes within establishments. So we paint a much more broader picture how these business tax rates actually affect local labor markets, workers and establishments. So let me summarize our key findings. So we find that an increase in the business tax rate by 1% reduces municipality employment by about 0.35%. It reduces municipality wages by about 0.1%, and it reduces establishment wages by a little less, by 0.6%. We also find that employment effects are stronger in high wage firms and in larger establishments. So what this means is that the composition of establishments in the municipality, it worsens if the business tax rate increases. And this helps to explain, so this contributes to why wages in the municipality are actually going down by more than wages within establishments. So now note that these firms that pay very high wages and these larger firms, these are attractive firms for workers to work in. So they are located higher up in the job ladder. And these firms really stop hiring. So what a business tax actually does is it slows down the rate at which workers move up the job ladder. And individual workers, they actually have lower wage growth in part because they are less likely to move up the job ladder. Okay, so I want to emphasize here that all these results refer to a local business tax rate change. We would typically expect that employment effects are stronger at the local level than if we consider a tax cut or a tax increase at the national or international level. Yeah, you're very silent. Feel free to interrupt. Just a few words on the theoretical framework we have in mind here. So we think of a tax on firms' profits as an increase in the cost of capital, in line with what the existing literature has done. So how does then, so if we make capital more expensive, how will this affect the firm's demand for labor? So this in fact is in principle ambiguous, because there is a substitution effect and a scale effect that work in the opposite direction. So on the one hand, if you make capital more expensive, firms may want to substitute capital for labor. So the demand for labor will go up. That's the substitution effect. So that's this part here. The substitution effect very crucially depends on the elasticity of substitution between capital and labor. Yeah, but on the other hand, if capital becomes more costly, well, overall costs of the firm are going up, and that will lead to a scale effect. So firms may want to scale down their production. Okay, this will ceteris paribus reduce the firm's demand for labor. So the scale effect depends on the product price elasticity. So the scale effect will generally be lower if firms are able to increase their product prices if the profit tax increases. And it also depends on the capital share in production. So more capital intensive firms will be hit harder by an increase in the profit tax, and they will face a larger scale effect. Okay, I will come back to this a bit later. So a few more words on the legislation. So as I said, firms' profits in Germany are taxed at the municipality level. And the effective tax rate, so that's this tau FMT in the municipality, is the product of two components. So first we have the federal tax rate. That is set by the federal state and is the same for all municipalities. In 2014, that rate was 3.5%. And then municipalities choose the CMT, so a factor by which this federal tax rate is multiplied. And they review this on a yearly basis, year after year. So in 2019, the CMT varied across municipalities between 2 and 9. So this means that the effective tax rate basically varied between 7% and 31.5% across municipalities. So we have very, very large range. Municipalities really choose different tax rates. The average was 13.5%. So now this business tax rate that applies to both incorporated firms and non-incorporated firms. So these incorporated firms on top of the business tax rate would also pay corporate tax rates, currently 15%. And the owners of the non-incorporated firms would additionally be liable to the personal income tax. So there are many more firms who are liable to this business tax than to the corporate tax, but yet there are some firms who are not liable to the business tax. So this would include firms in agriculture or in the public sector. So, so we look at the period 1999 to 2014. We have more than 9,000 municipalities we consider here. So roughly 20% did not change their municipality, their business tax rate at all through the entire period. We have about 1/3 of municipalities who changed it exactly once. But then we also have some municipalities who change more than once. In our sample, business tax increases are much more common than business tax cuts. So actually, yeah, most of our tax changes are business tax increases. So it is true that many of our business tax changes are relatively small in magnitude, but we also have a number of tax changes that are actually reasonably large, so more than 10% or even 20%.
Can you say something about the spatial correlations of those changes?
Yes, so we did look at, well, if one municipality increases the tax rate, do the neighboring municipalities within the same commuting zones react as well? They react not much at all. Yeah, is that what you had in mind? So,
right.
So that's correlations in changes in tax rates. So if you're interested in the spatial correlation just in the cross section, then well, some states on average charge higher tax rates than other states.
Okay. And how likely is that the workers are mobile between municipalities so that they can live?
I will show you some evidence on that. So that's coming up. Yeah, so when I talk about how the tax rate affects employment in the municipality, that will in part be driven by these worker movements across municipalities.
One quick question. Is this the only local tax existing that municipalities put forth, or is there other taxes?
It's the main local tax. It's also the main source of like finance for the municipality. So there's one additional local tax, which is the property tax. So it doesn't seem to be particularly correlated with this tax here, but it's much, much smaller in magnitude. So what is the data we are using? Our main data comes from Social Security records. So we have access to all workers and establishments covered by the Social Security system as of June 30th in the years 1999 to 2014. Just a few comments on the sample restrictions. The most important one here really is we restrict the sample to those establishments who are liable to the business tax. So we exclude the public sector and the agricultural sector and some small other sectors. So this data set is great if we want to study workers, employment, movements of workers across firms, across municipalities, but it doesn't have any information on the capital stock of the establishments. So we draw on data from Bureau van Dijk to learn about how the business tax affects firms' capital choices. So the sample period here is quite a bit smaller, 2008 to 2014. The Bureau van Dijk data has a number of additional problems I don't want to highlight here. So compared to the Social Security data, it's not really a representative data set for all establishments in Germany. So it's definitely overrepresents the larger firms and those and the corporated firms. Okay. So what's empirical design? The basic idea is very simple. It's a very standard difference in difference approach where, well, we have some treated municipalities where the municipality tax has, the business rate tax has changed, and some control municipalities where in that year the business tax rate did not change. So we run regressions both at the municipality level and at the establishment level. Most of our outcomes are measured in logs. So at the municipality level, we regress the outcome of interest, let's say log employment, on the log of the effective tax rate, and then we include year fixed effects and municipality fixed effects. The establishment level, we estimate a very similar regression, but instead of municipality fixed effects, we have establishment fixed effects in the regression. So the establishment level regressions, they really look at changes in employment and wages within the same establishment. Okay, so it's important to point out that, so it's a log-log specification typically. So the effects we estimate refer to an increase in the business tax by 1%. So let me first show you some results for wages.
Before did you say something about what's behind those changes? Why would the municipality change? What's the political economic context? I mean, to understand
Yes.
how endogenous is these things that.
So of course that's. I mean, of course, we worry here that these changes may be endogenous. In particular, from an identification point of view, we mostly worry that these tax changes are correlated with shocks in the municipality. So, well, I will show you a lot of evidence, hopefully, that to rule this out, so that we are not simply picking up location-specific shocks.
But do you have a story? Okay. Why are municipalities changing the taxes? I mean, so in part, common picture.
So yes, we should look a bit more into that. So there is probably a party component. The more left-leaning parties tend to charge higher tax rates than the more right-leaning Christian Democrat Party. We could actually look into that and try to exploit that more directly. Yeah, but it's also, so if you regress these municipality tax changes, it's not, so I will show you some event study results. It doesn't look like it's really strongly predicted by events that happened in the municipality before that. Yeah, okay, so let me start with the municipality level wage response. So in the first column here, that is really, this is the estimate that refers to the simple difference in difference regression I've shown you at the municipality level. So this estimate here would indicate an increase in the business tax by 1% would lower wages in the municipality by 0.12%. Okay, so we exploit tax changes here at a very disaggregated local level. That is actually smaller than how we would typically think of a local labor market, which would be the commuting zone. So what we do in the second column here is we allow for commuting zone by year fixed effects. So that means we actually control very flexibly for local shocks at a higher level. And in this specification, we exploit changes in the business tax rates over time across municipalities within a commuting zone. Coefficient is a bit lower, but the overall picture really is the same. Okay, and then an important reason why some local areas grow more than other local areas is because the industry structure is different, and industries are hit by very different shocks. So to deal with that we include in the third column here the baseline industry shares in the municipality in 1999, the first year of our data. And then we interact that with year fixed effects. So to soak up industry level, so nationwide industry level shocks. And again, we get a very similar estimate. Okay, so in the fourth column here, we move to a regression at the establishment level, and this reduces the coefficient by quite a bit. So according to this estimate in the fourth column, an increase in the business tax rate by 1% lowers wages by 0.06%. Okay, so it does look like that the wage response within establishments, so holding the composition of establishments fixed, is smaller than the wage response in the municipality as a whole. So what about employment then? We do find employment effects. Employment is going down. So an increase in the business tax rate by 1% lowers employment in the municipality by 0.35%. And this is very robust across these three different specifications. If we move on and estimate this at the establishment level, we get a slightly smaller coefficient. So what does explain why this is going down? Well, in the establishment level regression, we really only pick up employment responses within continuing firms. And we are missing employment responses that come from establishment entry and establishment exit. Yeah, so what this fourth coefficient really tells you is most of the decline in employment in the municipality level is happening within continuing establishments, and only a little bit is coming from establishment entry and establishment exit. So roughly, 15 to 20% is coming from establishment entry and exit. So employment is going down, right? So this would indicate that the scale effect dominates the substitution effect. So here we've done some event study graphs. So what we've done for the event study here is we've picked municipalities that experienced only one change over the time period of at least 1 percentage point. So relatively large, somewhat larger change. And then the control municipalities are municipalities that did not experience any change throughout our sample period. So this is the figure for wages. I think it looks okay. Yeah, not much is happening in the years before the tax change. Then in the years after the tax change, wages tend to go down in the treated municipality relative to the control municipality. And this is the picture for employment. This figure looks, I think, pretty nice. So employment in treated and control municipalities evolves very similarly in the years prior to the tax change, and then starts to decline in the treated municipalities relative to the control municipalities after the tax change happened. And these effects are building up over time.
Hi Uta, this is Jenny speaking. If you just go back to the wage graph, it looks like there's a trend that sort of starts before zero and then
so yeah, so if you're referring to these, this looks a bit like a trend. Yes. So the employment graph looks nicer. I do agree with that. So yeah, I mean, on the other hand, I mean, here it's going up again. I mean, there's always this problem with event study graphs. So the employment effects are definitely more novel here than the wage effects, which had already been analyzed by Fuß, Zikluch, and al. Okay. So then we use we go to the Bureau van Dijk data to see whether the business tax increase also affects capital. So I told you the way people typically think about an increase in profit taxation is that it increases the cost of capital. So we would then definitely expect that the capital stock, so the firm's demand for capital in the municipality should decline. Here the substitution and the scale effect would work in the same direction. And we do find that in the Bureau van Dijk data. So this coefficient here would mean a 1% increase in the business tax rate reduces the capital stock in the municipality by 0.25%. This is quite robust across these three specifications. Yeah, so now the Bureau van Dijk samples different firms than the social security data I talked previously about. So to compare the capital response with the employment response, we create a sample in the social security data to mimic the Bureau van Dijk sample as much as we possibly can. Okay, in this sample, so we also find a negative employment response. That is a bit smaller than the response we found for the sample as a whole. So the employment response is slightly smaller than the capital response. Nevertheless, this very clearly means, well, capital and labor seem to be complements rather than substitutes. And if you want, you can actually take these estimates seriously and back out the elasticity of substitution between capital and labor. And then you get an estimate that is actually well below 1. So the estimate that would be implied by the Cobb-Douglas production function. Okay, so overall, it looks like more capital and labor complements. Okay, so next thing we do is we look at how these employment effects vary across firm types. So here we've split up the establishments according to an establishment wage fix effect that we estimated in these AKM style regressions. So we categorize establishments into categories based on their AKM establishment fixed effect. And then it looks like that the employment effects tend to be largest in establishments that have the highest wage fixed effect. So in firms that pay particularly high wages. So yeah, so it's like twice as high at the very top firms than at the firms or establishments located further down. So this means that the composition of the type of establishments operating in the municipality, it worsens as the business tax rate increases. Okay, so it shifts towards those firms who pay lower wages. So in fact, if you this AKM establishment fixed effect, it declines on average in the municipality. It declines in response to the business tax rate somewhat, and that's actually exactly the reason why the wage response at the municipality level was higher than at the establishment level. Okay, because once we look at the within establishment level regressions, we eliminate any compositional changes as we only look at wage changes within the same establishment. We can do the same and categorize establishments according to their size, and a similar picture emerges. So it's the larger firms that respond more. Okay. So what we do next is that is going back to a little bit what Victor asked. We try to understand, well, how does municipality employment adjust? And what we do in the first step is we decompose the overall employment effect into an effect that is coming from reduced inflows, so hiring basically stops, and outflows. So these would be separations. Okay, so the overall employment effect is here, this 0.36. Basically what you can see is that hiring very much declines, actually by more than the overall employment effect. And somewhat surprisingly, outflows, separations also decline. They don't go up. Okay, so what is going on here? In the next step, we break down these outflows and these inflows into employment to employment outflows or inflows, and employment to non-employment transitions, or vice versa. Okay, so let's first look at the outflows here. So what you can see is that outflows from employment to non-employment are basically not affected. Okay, so what is not going on is that firms lay off workers when their business tax rate increases, and then these workers become unemployed. That's not what is happening. So what is going down is these employment to employment outflows from one establishment to another. Okay, and most of these employment to employment outflows would occur within the same commuting zone, and then partly within the same municipality, but also outside the municipality, but within the same commuting zone.
This is within 1 year adjustment, because it might be some times between employment and a new employment. So it's within a year, the adjustment. So one can be laid off in January and find a job in December. You will classify him as employment to employment.
So this is from June to June.
Right, okay.
Right, so we do, I don't think I will have time for this. I mean, we can look at 2-year adjustment, or we can look at the workers, trace out the workers, follow the workers, and then look over longer time period what the workers are actually doing. Yeah. For hiring, basically a similar picture emerges. So firms do hire less from non-employment or unemployment, so these transitions slightly go down, but it's mostly that these transitions from establishment to establishment, from employment to employment, that they are going down. Okay, so what is going on here? So it seems that establishments really reduce hiring. Now recall that employment effects were larger for the way that the establishments high up the job ladder. Yeah, so they are really the ones who reduce hiring. But then what also happens is that worker churning in the municipality really decreases. Okay, so there were workers who would have moved to these larger, more higher paying establishments if the business tax rate increase had not happened. So they don't move to these firms now. So what do they do instead? They may actually stay put with their current establishment. And that would provide an explanation why employment to employment separations actually also go down in response to a business tax increase. Okay, so this overall is consistent with the idea, well, that workers are less likely to separate to other firms or establishments, and they are less likely to move up the job ladder. Okay, so in the next step, we investigate this in a bit more detail. And what we do here is we go back to the sample we created for the event study. So we have the municipalities that were treated and experienced one change throughout our period. And then we have the control municipalities that didn't experience any tax change. So now we look at these workers who were employed in the municipality before the business tax change happened, and we follow them over a longer period. Here are the wage results after 1 year, after 2 years, and after 3 years. So these workers experience lower wages in the treated. So in the treated workers experience lower wage growth than the control workers that become a bit larger over time. So we can then split up this overall wage growth here into a component that is coming from within establishments, and that is coming from moving up the job ladder between establishments. And what you can see is, well, wage growth within establishments declines, but also the between establishment component is there. Okay, so in part, workers experience lower wage growth because they are less likely to move up the job ladder, move from employment to employment, and that hurts their wage growth over this period.
I wanted to ask, I mean, you relate quite a lot of these effects to the structure of labor demand and the substitutability between labor and capital, but have you also thought about relating them to elasticity of labor supply in this case? Because I mean, the employment and wage changes also depend on that elasticities, and in particular on whether there is like mobility across municipalities. So I wonder whether you could expect a heterogeneous effect according to tax changes in municipalities that are very well connected to other municipalities, and labor supply could be elastic, and other municipalities that are very much self-contained, and then workers don't move.
That's a good question. So actually, if you cannot recall, if the expression I showed in the theoretical framework had the wage response still in there, right? So the wage response, of course, is endogenous. And an important component that drives this wage response is exactly the labor supply elasticity. Okay,
and then, I mean,
and here I think it is really important to stress once again that we investigate a local tax change, right? Because the local labor supply elasticity is probably much, much higher than at the national level. So that would then mean that the wage response probably is smaller at the local level, but we have a larger labor employment response.
Thanks, because that is also related to the question about possibly the endogeneity of tax changes, because municipalities can decide what to do with the corporate tax depending on how sort of mobile they perceive, and how elastic they perceive the labor supply to be, if they care about changes in employment.
Right. What would you suggest? We should. I mean, we could try to see whether these wage and employment responses are different for well-connected and less well-connected municipalities.
This is one way to look at the differences in labor supply elasticity, and also another way to think is whether municipalities might internalize that and intervene with tax changes.
So overall, my impression is, I mean, these local mayors are not as sophisticated as you are in this regard. So yeah, but that's a good idea. We could try to look into that.
Can I ask a quick question following the Barbara's question about labor supply? So I think one assumption that you make is this assumption that many papers make, that business taxes are taxes on capital, on cost of capital. which in a way is assuming that the whole incidence of the tax is on capital. Whereas I think here you have all the tools to answer that question and tell us how much of the incidence is on labor and how much of the incidence is on capital, which seems to be a first order question.
Yes, of course, yes. So given that wages decline and employment declines, it very clearly seems to be the case that the incidence is not just on capital, right? So it's not the case that workers necessarily benefit if you make the factor capital more expensive. So I haven't used the words tax incidence here, but a lot of the results I showed here, of course, speak to exactly that question.
I thought in your setting, you're assuming that the tax is on the capital directly.
In the theoretical framework I laid down, so that's just the theoretical framework. I mean, the empirical analysis, I don't make any assumption like that. In the theoretical framework, so so as long as firms are not able to deduct their full capital costs from profits, which is the case in most in Germany, actually in pretty much every country, then basically taxing firms' profits is equivalent to increasing the cost of capital. Okay, so that's simply the way how the literature typically thinks about a tax and profits. I probably was a bit fast on that matter. Okay. So yeah.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I asked a question on the chat box, but I guess you didn't see it. I just wanted to follow up on Victor's question and the idea that the tax changes are reflect maybe a political change. I guess one worry is that then it's not about past shocks, which you're looking at those past trends, but the problem is that the change in taxes are correlated with other concurrent policy changes or even the expectation of policy changes. So I guess
other policy changes.
I think tax, for example, it'd be really important to look at other policy changes to be able to have something to say about.
So
in
terms of policy changes, I think we're really on the safe side because it's really only this business tax rates where municipalities have a lot of control. Right, so many other policy changes we can think of, they would be the decisions would be made at a higher level, not at the municipality level. We look at here. Okay, yeah, I am actually ready.
Infrastructure, infrastructure, like anything that could.
Yeah, that infrastructure investments would. That's typically not only decided at the municipality level. It would be decided at the district level, somewhere higher up. Yeah. So these municipalities are really a relatively, very small regional unit. So I am actually ready to conclude here. So overall, it seems like, business tax increase doesn't look like to help workers much at all, on the contrary, right? So employment goes down, wages go down, worker churning goes down, workers move up the job ladder less. Before you now conclude, then it seems a good idea. Let's just slash business tax rates. So I want to point out two things. Well, one thing that we have already discussed. Here, this is a local profit taxation at a highly disaggregated level. And we would typically expect the capital and employment effects to be larger at the local level than at the national level. Yeah, so these results, so maybe this is one way to conclude here is, well, if we think about business taxation, maybe this should be done at the national or even international level. So another comment I want to make here, well, our results suggest that in the period we looked at, capital and labor, if anything, I mean, they seem to be complements. They do not seem to be substitutes. But if you think about new technologies, well, machines seem to get ever smarter. So machines may well look like they can increasingly perform tasks we previously thought only us humans can perform. So if that is actually the case, it may well be the case that capital and labor becoming increasingly substitutes. Yeah, and if that is the case, well, then actually so we may as well see the opposite. So if labor and capital really are substitutes, then it could well be the case in the future if we increase profits more, labor employment will now increase, that wages will now increase. And yes, then we could get exactly the opposite of what we found here. Any more questions if we have time?
There's time for maybe a couple of quick questions. Yeah, Claire Lelarche raised hand. Claire, you can ask your question directly.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this. I mean, great brief. Just to remark on your last point, I was wondering, do you have information about multi-plant firms? Because if you had some kind of corporate finance approach, you could maybe part of your result could be driven by those multi-plant firms reallocating their activities and employment to plants that become cheaper to operate relative to those that are more taxed, and it would contribute to explain the fact that you find a higher effect than at the national level.
Yeah, so if we linked the Bureau van Dijk data to the Social Security data, we would be able to identify multi-establishment firms, even with the data we have at hand. So far we haven't linked them. You can actually see whether a chunk of workers from one establishment moves to another establishment. That does not seem to be all that much affected by the business tax. So because most of the employment response is really happening within existing establishments. Yeah, so it doesn't look like, what I'm saying, it doesn't look like that these movements from really where you move a lot of workers from one establishment to the other, arguably possibly within the same firm, it doesn't happen much at all.
It might not be moves, but simply having more and elsewhere. But thank you so much. Yeah.
Hello.
We can have one last question. There was a hand raise.
Yeah. Hello.
Go ahead. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, Amalram Rao here. Okay, the point is when there is a transition, I mean, frictional unemployment happen, then it's also affect the social security. In fact, then social security, have you looked into at the municipality level, or it's a matter of policy at the national level?
Okay, so I'm not sure I got that question.
See, if there is a change, right? When the people are moving from one farm to another one,
yes,
then there will be a frictional unemployment happening within the same year also, right?
Not necessarily, no.
Okay, then there might be a gap between one employment to another employment, right?
Yes, without intervening unemployment spell.
Yeah, in between, whatever 1 month or 2 months or 3 months, if there is also any impact of the social security at the municipal level.
So you are asking what is happening on a monthly basis or on a more detailed basis rather than year by year?
Yeah, monthly. I mean to say the transition period I'm asking.
Yeah, so the data we have, we can't see this. On average, wage growth for these moving from employment to employment is much higher than wage growth for those who stay. So most of these, I would assume, doesn't involve an unemployment transition.
Okay, and the one more point here, Uta, the social security, that is policy governed through municipality, but it's, I think, a policy has implication from national side, right?
From what?
In social security is covered by the national government or at the municipality level?
The state government.
State government, okay.
I think,
All right. Provincial you're talking about, right? Provincial or national government you're talking about?
Sorry.
Is it a provincial government or is it national government?
Provincial, state.
Okay, fine.
Okay, excuse me for stepping in. We should probably close here. So thank you very much, Uta, for your presentation. Thanks for opening the conference. And we should leave the floor to Arash Nekoi talking about the impact of advance notice in layoffs. Thanks a lot.